Good afternoon. My name is Sonia Lee. I teach Asian art history at USC and I also direct the East Asian Studies Center at the university. I would like to welcome you all to today's very special event. This is the first in a new webinar series that we launched this year titled Regulatory Science, East Asian Perspective. We started this series this year in response to the many health and wellness challenges that we faced during the global pandemic. It also represents an exciting opportunity for us at the center to collaborate with colleagues at the Health Science campus. There is so much that we can learn from each other in a time of great anxiety, confusion, and misinformation. Today, we are very fortunate to have two leading experts from the university who can help us better understand the development of drugs during pandemics, and also to help set the record straight on some of the drugs that we have heard so much in the news in recent months. Perhaps they even have some good news about vaccines. So I welcome the audience to ask questions at the end. Now, for those of you in the audience who are new to our event, let me just say a few words about the East Asian Studies Center. So it's been part of the USC community since 1975. The center is home to over 120 affiliated faculties across 40-some departments and schools. As you can see, diversity, disciplinary diversity is our strength. In addition to this new series on regulatory science, we also launched a new webinar series called Race Solidarity, Trans-Pacific Conversations, which we hope to provide a platform for faculty and students to engage with a host of social and cultural issues related to race and racism on both sides of the Pacific. In fact, our next event is on October 29th. It will feature Professor Adrian De Leon in the American Studies and Ethnicities, who has actually done extensive work on Filipino health workers in the United States. So it will be an interesting crossover for some of the colleagues over at Health Science Campus to hear them to talk about anti-Asian racism and also social justice across the Pacific. He's going to be joined by two multimedia journalists, Dolly Lee and Joey Yang. And I also like to thank the staff for putting the technical aspect of this webinar together. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our two speakers today. Dr. Eunjoo Pacifici is Associate Professor and Chair of Regulatory and Quality Sciences in the School of Pharmacy at USC. She's also the Associate Director of the D.K. Kim International Center of Regulatory Science at USC that specializes in generating knowledge, tools, and skills for the development of innovative, safe, and effective biomedical products. Dr. Pacifici received her PharmD and PhD in toxicology at USC. After graduation, she worked at Amgram and gained experience in conducting clinical research and also with a special focus on Asia Pacific and Latin American region. She worked with local clinical and regulatory staff in Japan, China, Taiwan, and Mexico to align local efforts with US activities in therapeutic product development. In addition to all this work, she's also involved in a community pharmacy practice in various settings, including the Hospital of Good Samaritan in Los Angeles. Dr. Terry Church is Assistant Professor in Regulatory Quality Sciences in the School of Pharmacy. So both of them are from the same department. He is also Associate Director of Undergraduate Education and teaches in the undergraduate degree program, Pharmacology and Drug Development, so PPD. Dr. Church received his Doctor of Science and Master of Science in Regulatory Science from USC as well. He has also, interestingly, an MA in Cultural Anthropology and a BA in Social Sciences. Professor Church's academic research focuses on interdisciplinary application of pharmaceutical regulation in relation to patterns of addiction, disaster management, education, and training. So you can see he's the kind of expert we need at this moment. He's also an avid supporter of creative art therapies and was involved in the initial setup of the Institute for Arts in Medicine at USC. He's a faculty fellow of the USC Center for Excellence in Teaching and also co-chair of the Educational Committee of Institute for Addiction Sciences. So please join me in welcoming both Dr. Pacifici and Dr. Church.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for having us. I'm going to turn over the presentations, Dr. Church, who will kind of, kind of host our conversation. I figure somebody has to be the leading host, so Dr. Church will serve that role. And although this is supposed to be more informal conversation, we do have a few slides to share with you, and so we're go ahead and kind of weave in some of your questions from the audience as we go along. But this is hopefully not meant to be a lecture format, although we're professors, so it's hard for us to stay away from lecturing. But it is definitely a pleasure to be with all of you. And I'm going to share my screen and then hand over the mic to Dr. Church.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And again, thank you to everyone for having us. Dr. Lee, I really appreciate it. And Grace, Jasmine, and Alex, you've been wonderful. So thank you very much for having us. Dr. Pacifici, I think that it would be best if we started off with an idea of what regulatory science is. I know a lot of people have heard this term in the past or may have heard it in the past, but what does it really mean? What does it embody?
Right. So regulatory science is relatively a new term. And even when I first started working in regulatory science, it always used to kind of stump me when people ask me, so what is regulatory science? I knew it intuitively, but it was always kind of hard for me to explain it. And so, what is regulatory science? Well, it is a new discipline that converges science, law, and business. Specifically, regulatory science relates the regulatory and legal requirements of biomedical product development, food, dietary supplements, to the scientific research needed to ensure the safety and efficacy of these products. So essentially, the regulatory science is related to how do you determine when a product is safe enough to be on the market? How do you determine that a product actually works? So that's kind of the safety and efficacy. So it goes almost without saying, especially during this time of COVID-19 pandemic, that regulatory science is all around us, right? I mean, we hear on the news from our concerns regarding the accuracy of diagnostics to our hopes for safe and effective medicines and vaccines so that we can come back to be on site, so we can have some free lunch, to go with these seminars, right? And regulatory science also impacts everyday products that we use, like cosmetics, toothpaste, things that we wear, like sunglasses and prescription glasses, and the food that we consume, and even the products that we use to care for our animals. So if you look at these headlines, these are recent headlines. 3 coronavirus vaccine developers report promising initial results. Early trials showed a good immune response in vaccinated subjects, but one researcher sounded a note of caution: there is still a long way to go. Why? If you saw good immune response, why do you have to wait? Why is there such a long way to go? Why can't you just give it to everybody right away, and then we can be back to normal? Second headline here: FDA cautions against use of hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine for COVID-19 outside of the hospital setting or a clinical trial due to risk of heart rhythm problems. So, what are the underneath all these headlines we see every day, like the development of vaccines or the off-label use of medications, are regulatory concepts regarding the importance of clearly demonstrating safety and efficacy of products before they become widely available. So in case of vaccines, well, vaccines are given to healthy population, right? They're not for the vaccines are preventative measures. And so they're given to healthy population in order to prevent them from coming down with COVID-19. So the benefit risk profile for vaccines is quite different than, for example, benefit risk profile for example, cancer treatment, right? Because the level of risk that the population can tolerate is quite different. So for vaccines, we need to really confirm safety and effectiveness for a healthy population, okay? To show a clear benefit with minimal risk before a product can be widely distributed. And so that's why you hear about vaccine trials, even after the early phase trials have shown good immune response. That has to be followed by large scale phase 3 trials that are often tens of thousands of clinical research subjects for phase 3 trials. So for example, I think the current vaccine trials, one is 30,000, the other one is 60,000. So these are huge trials because you need to be able to include a wide array of the population so that we can have a generalized understanding of the safety and efficacy profile of these products. The second is the concept of off-label use. So hydroxychloroquine is a malarial drug. It hasn't been thoroughly studied for COVID-19. So the product is available, but it's not labeled. It hasn't been studied, and you don't have an accurate way of using this product in the COVID-19 patient population. So this is what we call off-label prescribing, and physicians are allowed to use off-label prescribing for products already on the market that have been approved for one use, but they can write an off-label prescription for another use. But the risk there is that there is limited data, sometimes no data at all, to demonstrate whether that product is safe and effective for the condition in question. So in case of hydroxychloroquine, there was this kind of mass fervor, and that this could be the cure for COVID-19, or it could even prevent COVID-19. And so there was a lot of off-label prescribing for this product. And in fact, FDA also allowed the use of this product through the emergency use authorization mechanism. But then it turned out enough data demonstrated that actually this product was harmful. And so FDA withdrew its authorization. However, the product is still on the market for other uses. And so physicians can still prescribe this off-label for COVID-19.
I think in terms of off-label, would you mind expanding a little bit on what it means to repurpose a drug, or what that process might look like?
That's a very, very interesting question. So repurposing a drug means taking a product like hydroxychloroquine that has been approved for one indication, studying it for another indication, for another disease, for another population, and then having enough data to be submitted to the FDA and getting FDA approval for that other indication. So that is repurposing. So that is the case of repurposing a product that's already on the market, pivoting it to include another population. Now there are other ways of repurposing a drug. For example, if a product has failed during drug development, and a company kind of abandoned it for one indication, may pick it back up and study it for another indication and maybe get that approved. So, or sometimes companies buy other companies' kind of products that have failed development. So essentially, you know, one person's garbage could potentially be another company's treasure. So there are companies that are in the business of repurposing. And so if you think about it, what repurposing potentially could do is it could potentially save a lot of time and resources, because if a product has already shown safety in human clinical trials, and they just need to confirm efficacy in a particular disease area, then you could avoid having to conduct all the animal studies and all the bench research, as well as healthy volunteer study, which are some of the earlier phase trials. So does that answer your question, Dr. Church?
It does, thank you. I was just trying to figure out how we could move this process along quicker in terms of COVID, and that seems to me to be the easiest route to do it, but there's still substantial work that needs to be done associated with it.
Yes, so there are a lot of antivirals that are being studied to see if some of the antivirals that are used for example, for influenza could be used for COVID-19, or maybe not particularly the antiviral that's already on the market, but there have been many antivirals that have been studied by various companies. And so there is kind of a ready treasure trove of drug candidates that can be pivoted to address COVID-19. But of course, it's still challenging because, as you and I know, bringing a new drug to the market is just really difficult to be able to find the molecule that is safe and effective in that particular condition or disease. The longer that I am in this business, the more astonished I am whenever a new drug is approved, because I know how hard that is. So.
Definitely.
So what Dr. Church and I have been discussing are products that are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. In the United States, that's the regulatory agency that regulates these products. And if you look at the impact of what our FDA does, FDA regulates products that represent $2.6 trillion a year, which is essentially 20 to 25 cents of every dollar spent by American consumers. So I'm sure from some of the products that I have just described that these products affect all of you. It's important also to remember, as we talk about, you know, the international aspects, and especially, you know, this is a collaboration with the East Asia Study Center, that US FDA only has jurisdiction in the United States. It's a US regulatory agency. As such, all the other countries, many of the other countries, have their own regulatory agencies. So here's PMDA, which is the regulatory agency in Japan, MFDS, which is the regulatory agency in South Korea, the Taiwanese FDA. There is the National Medical Products Administration, which is NMPA. This is the China's FDA. You know, they make it so difficult for us. There was a time a few decades ago where they used to all call themselves, you know, Korean FDA. So it was KFDA, and then China FDA was CFDA. You know, that's so much easier for us. But for us in regulatory agencies these days, I have to remember, MFDS and NMPA. And then they, of course, changed their names. Like, you know, PMDA used to be COSATIO, we used to call, and then they changed names a few more times, and now it's PMDA. So, big part of being in regulatory science is memorizing all these acronyms. And so,
And
as
to be
in
current.
all the specialized, yes.
Definitely. So while we're on the topic of these agencies, would you mind characterizing what the Asian context looks like in terms of regulatory affairs?
Yes. So, in the last decade or so, even though United States FDA is just U.S. regulatory agency, okay, and their mandate is to protect the U.S. public health, okay, safeguard U.S. public health. The problem is that it turns out that the supply chain has become very globalized, and I don't know if our audience knows this, but 80% of the active ingredients that go into your medicine, they come from abroad, primarily from India and China. 80% of seafood comes from abroad, although we have a lot of bodies of water around us. For one reason or another, for some reason, 80% of our seafood comes from abroad. And that shrimp that you ate last night for dinner most likely is from Vietnam or Thailand. 40% of finished dosage drugs, which means that the actual finished tablets or finished capsules or finished injectables, they come from abroad. Okay. And 50% of fresh fruit, we all know that because in the middle of winter, we expect to have our peaches and our strawberries and our watermelons, right? And 20% of fresh vegetables. So how does FDA safeguard public health in the United States if they only have jurisdiction within United States? So this has posed a huge challenge for the FDA over the last few decades, and they need to collaborate with other agencies around the world. They need to have presence, although they don't have jurisdiction. FDA now has presence in all the continents around the world, almost all the continents around the world.
From what you've described, it sounds like there's a huge and vast market out there that's just waiting to expand in terms of both domestic and imported products coming out of Asia. Could you walk us through that a little bit in terms of
yes,
growth?
Absolutely. So it's a two-way street. So our interest from United States or even for multinational industry point of view is that we get a lot of product from abroad, from Asia, in terms of active pharmaceutical ingredients as well as finished medical products. But as the economy is growing in Asia, and they are growing very rapidly, probably beyond people's imagination for the last couple of decades, the market there has been growing as well. So not only do they supply our needs, but they also buy products that the multinational companies produce. So they are both the supplier for certain things and customers for other things. And so the region, the Asia as a pharmaceutical market has really expanded. So this is the pharmaceutical industry, the pharmaceutical market has been growing. It's quite large. It is right now at over $1.2 trillion in terms of global market. And that's shown by these green bars. I remember when I first started giving these lectures, the global pharmaceutical market was something like $250 billion. And so I'm kind of dating myself because I've been in this area for a long time. But even then, we thought it was pretty large. But now, not only is it surpassed $1 trillion, and chances are it'll continue to grow. And for as long as I can remember, the pharmaceutical market has always been growing. So even in the 2008 recession, the pharmaceutical market was still expanding. So you can see the yellow line never has gone below zero for as long as I can remember. So, which, for all of you kind of should look at this and say, wow, that's a really interesting sector. If you're a business major, you might say, that is a really interesting business, right? If you're interested in the Asian economy or Asia in general, this is really interesting as well because Asia represents such a big market. So in context, in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, something like 80% of the world's pharmaceutical market was represented by United States, Western European countries, and Japan. Okay, and so essentially, if you're a big multinational company, you could just focus on those three regions and you would have over 80% of the market covered. It's no longer the case. Countries like China, South Korea, Brazil, India, those countries have really grown with regards to their economy. And when countries become richer, they can afford medicines. And so their pharmaceutical market expanded pretty dramatically. So that, this is the pharmaceutical market by country. And you can see that number one market has always been United States for as long as I can remember. But number two and number three are China and Japan. Now, China came up to be number two within just the last few years. For as long as I can remember, Japan was always number two. And then just a few years ago, as China's economy expanded, they overtook Japan and became number two. So you can see those are coveted spots, number two and number three, both East Asian countries. South Korea, even though it's a tiny country, is still up there next to between Australia and Canada. And then you can see, usually the big five markets in Europe are Germany, France, Italy, UK, Spain. And if you look at China, we expect China's market to continue to grow. I mean, they have a lot of room to grow, even though we say, wow, they're number two, that's fantastic. But they have a lot of potential to grow because United States, in number one position, is a country of 350 million people. China is a country of 1.3 billion people. And as their per capita income increases and their middle class expands, I would imagine that they will be at some point number one market. The question is when. So is it going to be in the next 5 years or next 10 years? But for sure, within that time frame, if things go as they have been going, I wouldn't be surprised if they become number one within the next 5 years.
Wow.
And so this is when it happened. 2014 is when China took their giant leap and overtook Japan in that number two spot.
Wow. And just projecting it forward, it looks like this steady growth is going to continue. And I would say as well, within the next 5 years, we could see a switch in that first position.
Yes, because I mean, when you have 1.3 billion people, and if you have the middle class that gets established within that population, yeah, I mean, it would be really interesting to see how China moves up the ladder, and because what this tells you right now is that per capita use of pharmaceuticals is far lower than any of these countries, right? So because this is a a cumulative total spending on medicines.
So these are percentages and different values that we've been looking at. What about some real numbers based on China's economic spending in terms of medicines?
So China's spending on medicines has been quite low until very recently. If you think about the fact that, and actually you can see it over here, if you think about the fact that United States spends $510 billion a year, for China to spend in 2010 less than $60 billion, that you can see how underserved that market has been. And so it has been growing up, and most recently it has gone over $140 billion. But you can imagine how this could easily double in the next few years. And if you look at the growth back in starting in early 2000s, China's growth rate was at double-digit growth. Like China's economy was growing in double-digit, and now that the base is quite high, it is growing at single-digit, but still at the high single-digit, which is it's far greater than, for example, if you were to compare that to Japan, right? The Japanese economy it's large, but they have been somewhat stagnant. So if you look at the growth rate of the Japanese economy and compared to the Chinese economy, in terms of pharmaceutical market size has been quite striking.
Excellent. So if you don't mind, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about COVID and how that's been playing out in Asia. One of the things that has really struck me during this whole pandemic is the fact that we are living through both minuscule and massive changes in terms of how we relate to one another and how we undertake business. One of the striking features, I think, is this increase in the United States into telemedicine and ways of connecting with our physicians and our pharmacists remotely. Is this something that is similar in the Asian market? Do you see it as having a good impact or a different impact in the health sector?
Yes, the thing that's interesting about the current pandemic is with all the shortcomings and the suffering that has occurred, if there's any kind of, I guess, silver lining, is our ability to take advantage of digital platforms. And as much as I end up sitting in front of Zoom all day, and sitting just like this all day from, sometimes from 7 till 7. But then I think about the fact that we have this technology. And if we didn't have Zoom, let's say we had this pandemic, I don't know, even just 10 years ago, how much more difficult things would have been. And so sometimes things like this actually kind of pushes a technology forward, and you're able to leapfrog things, a process forward in ways that maybe you couldn't have imagined previously. So in United States, yeah, telemedicine, I remember studying about telemedicine, decades ago, and things, things were just not properly aligned until very recently. And so there's a technology part of it. There is, all the privacy laws, so that there's a legal and regulatory aspect of it. And then the third part is reimbursement, right? If healthcare providers will get paid for telemedicine, okay, then it is more likely that a technology will be adopted. And so, in the United States, I think we saw a huge shift just within a few months, right? And so and I thought it was really great. I had my first telemedicine appointment, and it was fantastic. So I didn't have to go and sit in a waiting room, drive and sit in a waiting room, sitting next to people who are coughing, and I was reading all the magazines that I wasn't interested in. Instead, I was able to sit in front of my computer, do all the things I needed to do until it was time for my appointment, and my physician was right there, in the face. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't running from one room to another. It was kind of cool. So, I might want to keep that even after the pandemic is over, for certain appointments anyway. So, and it's the case also in Asia. So, this was a recent report by Bain and Company, how COVID-19 has accelerated the adoption of telemedicine in Asia Pacific countries. So, the digital platform has been quite embraced by the Asian countries. I don't know if many of you have traveled to Asia, but I know that when I travel to Asia, I find that they are more digitally connected than in the United States even. I find that the internet speed is higher or faster, and that there is Wi-Fi everywhere.
Everywhere.
Exactly, everywhere. And then I come back here and I don't have cell service, and I have to be like out in the middle of the street, dodging, traffic to get some cell service. So yeah, and so in some ways, perhaps some of the countries in Asia may be really well positioned to adopt telemedicine. So sure enough, if you look at consumers expect to make greater use of digital health services in the next 5 years. This is the Asia Pacific survey of close to 2,000 people. And yeah, everybody's very optimistic about, from now till 5 years from now, that everything from telemedicine to digital health to online pharmacy, everything, they expect things to happen more readily in the next 5 years.
That does raise a concern, though. Going back to your analogy of running out into the street to find the best cell service available, do you think that's a problem that we would see in the Asian markets as well? I know South Korea aside, because they have the best digital technology available. But if you were in other parts of Asia, do you think that it would be problematic to have digital health?
Well, I'm not sure because I haven't researched that area all that well. However, one of the things I know is, when you go to countries like China and some of the other Asian countries, you have the big cities, especially, in those big countries, you have big cities. And within the big cities, services are easily accessible. But when you go to more of the rural area, they are not. And so for example, China is really working hard to expand its technology and its healthcare and transportation from the major centers of Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou to the western rural communities. And they're building hospitals, and so but yes, I would imagine that the experience of or access to technology in large cities would be, quite different from experience of population who lives in the rural areas. And unlike United States and some of the advanced economies, the emerging markets see a lot of their population living in the rural area as well. So yes, that would be an issue for sure.
Excellent.
Having that said, having said that, China has been pretty remarkable in how fast they are able to do things. I remember for the Beijing Olympics, they had, I don't know, Terry, maybe you were on that trip with us, but they went from having 2 subway lines to 10 subway lines within 5 years. And so
it's phenomenal,
which is unheard of in United States. I mean, in United States, to go from, to dig, maybe to add 5 more miles of a subway track, you have to go through years of petitioning and public hearing and everything else. So yeah, so things can happen in China and countries like China faster. I guess China is probably one of the most dramatic in terms of being the central administration being able to engineer technology and infrastructure across the country. So you can see that in coronavirus in China has accelerated the growth of China's online medical platforms.
So a lot of us have used, I'm sure, WebMD or similar types of platforms, and that's kind of the data and information that we're talking about here. What do you think about the users? I mean, they have all of these great sites and it looks like they're 900%, but is that across Asia Pacific or is that just China, do you think, in terms of its use?
Yeah, so embracing digital technology has been pretty remarkable across all of Asia. And so you can see, new users of telemedicine, the various different platforms in Asia Pacific just rising sharply in just the first few months. This is in Singapore. MyDoc platform has risen more than 160%. So if you think about it, a lot of these countries in these regions, as well as in the United States, when you go to the big hospitals, the wait time is quite remarkable. So if you were, even in South Korea, you have some of these major medical centers where everybody gravitates toward. But when you go there, inevitably, you're waiting for a long time. And so I think the convenience of moving to a digital platform is something that I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really illuminated. And so also, I think the government doesn't want people congregating at the big medical centers. And so their regulatory scheme has been more flexible to adopt these types of digital platforms. And so, and many of the countries in East Asia now have universal health care. And so the reimbursement scheme is such that it really promotes telemedicine. So all these things in combination is really resulting in the rises like this we were seeing just in a few months.
So from my perspective, I think it will ultimately change the way that business gets done. I mean, this pandemic has already shown us new ways that we can work in finance, new ways that we can undertake school, for example, and even healthcare. And I think that the next few years is going to be fundamentally different in terms of the economic state of those areas.
Absolutely, yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how the technology will shift the healthcare delivery all around the world. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, some things obviously telemedicine cannot accomplish, but you could also see a lot of the things that telemedicine could potentially accomplish. And so perhaps in East Asian countries, as well as in United States, we might see the system become more nimble and more efficient and maybe more patient-centric. So that, you know, so that would be interesting to see. So if you look at some of the expert opinions, Asia Pacific healthcare will shift dramatically in the next 5 years in terms of, you know, the developing healthcare landscape will represent more than 40% of growth in global healthcare spending. Yeah, as I mentioned, as the region expands their economic footprint, so will their spending on healthcare. And this we're going to talk about a little bit later, aging population. Yeah, the life expectancy in many of the Asian countries are as high as United States or even higher, which is both good and bad. I always think it's good. As I get older, I like to see the life expectancy continue to increase, but that also means that you have a population that is going to need healthcare more. You are going to have a population that may leave the workforce. So who is going to replace that workforce, the pipeline? How are you going to fill that workforce pipeline is a question. And of course, natural thing is, yes, you're going to fill that workforce pipeline with the new birth, new addition to your population. But at the same time, some of these countries, their birth rate is really low. And so that's also worrisome, although, you know, with something like 8 billion people on Earth, you know, you would think that's not a problem. But for individual countries, it does represent a problem. And, you know, so you can see, again, the digital delivery models. So essentially, the take-home message is that the healthcare spending will grow in this region. They will continue to age, so they will have really their profile, demographic profile will look quite different from some of the other regions around the world, and that they will be adopting digital platform quite fast, quite quickly.
The shocking number for me here is this older population. I mean, it just is phenomenal to think about that half of the population, 500 million people, that's more than the United States in total, will be age 65 or older. That is just mind-boggling for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah, well, I'll be one of them soon. So.
You have a few more years to go. Many more, actually.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay, it's okay. The 65 will be the new 45, and that's that's my delusional thinking. Okay.
The other surprising thing here for me is the fact that there were such a high percentage of people who were willing to embrace the digital market. And I think that has to do with the availability of internet access, including mobile speeds.
Yes, yes. So this being the East Asian Study Center, you ought to be happy that the #1 country in terms of internet speed is an East Asian country, South Korea. And if you have ever traveled to South Korea, or you have friends in South Korea, or relatives in South Korea, they had digital phones, I don't know, 30 years ago. And so, yeah, so, and China is right up there. I mean, my goodness, when I first used to travel to China in 1990s, they had the little, you know, rotary phone And that was hard to come by too. Not everybody had the rotary phone. Now, everyone has Samsung and iPhone. So yes, it's been pretty remarkable. And of course, Japan. I'm surprised. I don't know actually what Japan's internet speed is, but their mobile technology is also very advanced.
So this is a great slide, I think, for us to begin our talk about research and development. And that is the bread and butter of the pharmaceutical industry. This is where we test, we develop, we deploy, and we retest often. In terms of pharmaceuticals or just medical products themselves, do you see specific areas in Asia as becoming hubs for specific products? So for example, is China the place that we should be looking at for medical devices, and Japan for immunologic devices or immunologic drugs? Is that a thing, or is it pretty dispersed in terms of development?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Now, China and South Korea and some of the other Asian countries have risen to the world stage only very recently. Japan has been an advanced market for a long time. I don't know if you guys remember in the 1980s, 1970s, and 1990s, Japan's economy was a booming economy, and the Japanese industry was quite advanced, and Japan spent a lot of money on research and development, and some of the Japanese pharmaceutical companies were quite innovative. Companies like Takeda and Astellas, which was Yamanouchi. So some of you might not know, because those Japanese companies back then used to develop products, and they would sell it to their domestic market, but then they would out-license the product, which was frequently done, to a multinational Western company to develop it for other regions. So for example, you all know Pepsid, right? So Pepsid was actually developed by a Japanese company, Yamanouchi, which is now Astellas. And so it was, until recently, because the Japanese companies did not enter United States, nobody knew that Pepsid was actually a very popular product, was actually developed by the Japanese company. Now, in the last 20 years or so, the Japanese companies have moved out of Japan to become truly multinational entities. And so we know that Alzheimer's drug that's very popular, Aricept, is developed and was developed and is commercialized by Eisai, which is a Japanese company, and other company like Otsuka and Astellas. Those are large companies. But then the other countries like China and South Korea and India and Taiwan and other countries, they really were not, their economies were not strong enough. They didn't have the deep pockets that are necessary to develop new drugs. Being in the new drug business require a lot of money. It takes over $2 billion and something like 15 years to bring a new drug to the market. And when you're kind of a struggling economy, you don't have that kind of capital, and you don't have that kind of time to bring to invest in the hopes that you will have new products. Also because the failure rate is so high, right? But then recently it has been changed. So for the longest time, China and South Korea and Taiwan and those countries were primarily focused on making generic drugs. It's only recently, as their economy became bigger, that they are looking at focusing their resources on innovative research in the medical product development, including medical devices and drugs and biologics. So South Korea a few years ago wanted to get new products to market. They said, because if you think about it, South Korea did quite well in terms of disseminating its brands, right? Hyundai cars, we have Samsung phones, LG TVs, refrigerators, washers, and dryers. And of course, the pop culture. South Korea has done really well exporting a lot of its brands globally. Considering it's a tiny little country, it's pretty remarkable. And their medical technology, their hospitals, their medical education is quite superior, and their scientific focus has been quite intense in the last couple of decades. So they thought, yes, let's go ahead and focus on developing new drugs. Well, as I mentioned, developing new drugs is very difficult. If you start off with 10,000 molecules, you might be lucky if you get one successful product. And they weren't that patient, because for these countries, innovative drug space is pretty shocking because of the kinds of failures that you run into. I mean, you don't like develop 10,000 cars in hopes of getting one successful car. I mean, these countries are used to, whether it's in the shipping industry, whether it's in the garment industry or car or computers, they're used to putting their effort and coming up with successful products. To be in a situation where you put in a lot of effort, where the failure rate is so high, is something that was quite, I think, shocking, I guess but one of the ways that South Korea was able to pivot its effort away from truly innovative products is to focus on biosimilars. And so South Korea, biosimilars are generic version of biologics, which are more difficult to produce than your regular aspirin or other kind of pills and capsules. Biologics are made out of proteins. You have to inject them. The way to make them is quite more complicated. But South Korea, having focused on biosimilars, have become very successful. In fact, I think the first two biosimilar products that were approved by the US FDA were produced by South Korean companies. So I would say, if anybody specialized in anything, I would say South Korea is now recognized by the world community as being a kind of the hub of biosimilars. China has been very active in both small molecules and biologics. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few years, we start to see innovative products coming out of China as well. Japan, as I mentioned, they're already in the game, and they have been for a while. And their chemical industry is quite sophisticated, and so I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to produce small molecule products. Japan also has been really focused on stem cell or regenerative medicine arena. And so that would be interesting to see if a lot of their effort actually produces fruits of therapeutics.
So one of the big things with R&D, obviously, is clinical trials. And how do you see clinical trials playing out in the Asian market? Are we experiencing more enrollments, more studies opening, or fewer studies opening in the Asian market?
Yes, so when we talk about clinical trials, there are some aspects that are related to clinical trials that have to be properly positioned. And for a long time, the standards for conducting clinical trials were not adopted in Asian countries. And so what we know as, what you and I know as the good clinical practice, they weren't adopted until, quite recently, although in the United States, the idea of well-controlled clinical trials to demonstrate safety and efficacy, the concept of administering informed consents for subjects who are interested in participating in clinical trials, all those items were already in place in the United States, and they have been since 1960s. In a lot of the Asian countries, those parameters have only recently been established. We're talking about really 2000s. And so, but having said that, having those frameworks established, the clinical research expanded like wildfire all across Asia. And so we can see here, location of clinical trials, and this is a nice site, clinicaltrials.gov, and you can see the number of clinical trials across the entire world, and you can see United States is still where the highest number of clinical trials are conducted, but you can also see a lot of clinical trials being conducted in China and Japan and elsewhere. In fact, South Korea, as I mentioned, has a really advanced medical system and sophisticated hospitals. Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea, it's #1 city in the world for conducting clinical trials. Considering the fact that they didn't have a regulatory framework for clinical trials until quite recently, that is pretty accelerated process. So this is where, broadly all the clinical trials that are currently being conducted. So I got this, I think, just this week. So this is quite current. And then you can also see where the COVID-19 clinical trials are being conducted currently. So these are both vaccines as well as therapeutics being conducted.
Excellent. So you beat me to the question. I was actually going to ask you if they were therapeutics or vaccines, but this does lead us to a question that was posed in the registration process for today from one of the attendees related to vaccines. And they were just curious to get our opinions on how anti-vaxxers would denounce vaccines. And I think that that's a very broad philosophical question, one that we may not necessarily have time to go into in depth in this one, but I think it's kind of difficult for people to watch what's happening in the news and try to understand if a vaccine would work, if it wouldn't work, if it's appropriate for them. And all I have to say to that, and this is tongue in cheek, so just bear with me, is how did that polio work out for you? And I'm I'm just kidding with that. I'm being glib, obviously, but I think that anti-vaxxers are going to have a internal dialogue about these situations that they're looking at. They take a lot of fake science and pseudoscience and try to turn it into something that's more scientific or more broadly applicable to their situation. And I think that watching the world in the current state that it's in, it's going to be difficult for people to try to anti-vax the issue of COVID-19. And that's just my personal opinion, but what are your thoughts on it, Dr. Pacifici?
Well, we think about therapeutics that are available right now, and if you look at before 1900s, there were really very little effective treatment. Okay, most people died of pneumonia or childhood infections like smallpox and measles, right? Typhoid. So even now, if you look at diseases, there are very few diseases that we can cure. Okay, cancer, we have treatments, but is it cured? No. I mean, you go into remission and you watch. We have good treatments for cancer, but are they curative treatments? Not really. No, I don't think so. I think the only thing that is really curative would be infectious diseases. So you have upper respiratory infection, you have a course of antibiotics, and most likely you're cured. That's about it. You have schizophrenia or any kind of, psychiatric disease. No, you don't have a cure. We have treatments, effective treatments, safe and effective treatments. Neurodegenerative diseases, arthritis, hepatitis C, also an infectious disease, most recently has a curative treatment in terms of direct acting antivirals like Harvoni and Sovaldi. I mean, that's been transformative. So we have a lot of treatments, but very few cures. And when you and it's even worse when you look at preventative products. We have really no preventative products for cancer except for HPV vaccine, right? Human papillomavirus vaccine, because it's linked to cancer. So for example, cancer can happen through genetic mutations, through environmental factors. And then another third one turns out to be viral. So if you have a viral causation for a cancer, then you can actually be vaccinated for that. That's like dream come true. In my wildest imagination, when I was studying as a graduate student, that it was a holy grail to find vaccine for cancer, and we have one, but it's only for one type of cancer, right? Out of hundreds, if not thousands, of different cancer types. So vaccines is the primary mechanism for prevention of diseases. So I would have died, I don't know, 50 times over if it wasn't for childhood vaccines. I could die from polio, from measles, from pneumonia, from typhoid, from mumps, rubella. I can just name off all the deadly infections that have been prevented because I got vaccinated. And so, yeah, if you look at turn of the last century, 1900s, life expectancy at that time was 45.
If you were lucky.
Yes. And life expectancy, and that brings us to the next. The life expectancy now is over 75 in the United States. If you are a Japanese woman, it's like high 80s. Now, it is expected that South Korea will surpass that in the next decade, that the life expectancy for South Korean females are supposed to be the highest in the world. Not that we're in any kind of competition, but we may actually win that competition, me being a Korean woman. But a large part, of course, life expectancy from going from 45 to 75 is more than just vaccines, but vaccines are a big part of it. The other things that are important are things like sanitation, access to clean water, and but vaccinations and antibiotics are definitely a big part of the equation. So I would say for if you are concerned about vaccines, you look at the data, and FDA and the scientific community is quite transparent about the data on the therapeutics that they approve. So go ahead and look at the data and look at and listen to the experts of infectious disease, and follow the science, follow the data. Now, there are two different mechanisms for getting access to vaccines. One is an emergency use authorization, which will provide vaccines in a limited capacity before all the data is available. And then there is the full approval process, which would be the mechanism for providing general access or commercialization of the vaccine. So there are two different mechanisms, and you really want to look at the data and make the decisions do what's best for yourself and your family and your community.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So I think just to pivot back to where we were before the anti-vax question, one of the things that's really striking for me is how quickly the economy is growing in terms of healthcare and health expenditures, especially in parts of the world that for so long, for the past century at least, were kind of stagnant. How do you see China or even South Korea moving through this economic growth curve, if we could, to modern day from 100 years ago or so?
Yes, so this is kind of a snapshot in the 2010s, 2015 to be exact, and you can see where we are. So the colors represent what part of the region, what continent. So you can see the red is Asia. The size of the circles represent the size of the population. So this is a relationship between health and economics. So the health is represented by life expectancy. Wealth is represented on the x-axis by income, per capita income. So anywhere from $1,000 per year of a personal income to 128,000 and above. So now I love this website, and I don't know if some of you are familiar with this website, but you could literally spend days immersed in this website. And I suggest you do that because I think you become a better world citizen by doing that. So I'm going to just click, and I may have to do a new share because it will open up a website. And
I think it's going to have to be a new share.
yes, I'm doing that right now. Thank you.
So I will say, while we're getting this queued up, after you showed this to me a few days ago, I have literally spent about 20 hours in here just playing around with different graphics and different views. It's very amazing, I think.
So this is where, so you can see that the two big circles are, this is India and China, as you can imagine, both of them over 1 billion people each. But you can actually, if you click on the play, you go from 1800s to now, and you'll be able to, so pay attention to those. So this is United States, the green circle. This is China, and that's India. And then I think that's Japan, and then South Korea is right there. So, all right, ready. Let me just maximize this screen so that it shows up. There's no sound, so you don't have to worry about it, but it's kind of cool. But you see how, like South Korea is stuck there, and then look at China jumping up and down, India jumping up and down. It all is related. If you go back and you're a history buff, you can go back and match to what happened in each of these countries. And look, after the Industrial Revolution in the United States, the acceleration of its economy, and then Japan.
And just as you would expect, around 1980, things in India and China change immediately and start rising really quickly. It's just phenomenal to watch this data play out in real time.
Yes, so I wanted to kind of share that with the audience. And let me go ahead and go back to my new share if I can find my, okay, here we go. And I lost my little, okay, sorry, my arrow got stuck somewhere and I cannot find the arrow.
Oh no.
Yeah, where did you go? Oh, here we go. Okay, I found
Awesome.
it, and here we go. No, sure. Is it working? Do you see my PowerPoint?
I do not yet.
Okay.
Oh, there's the arrow though.
Okay. All right. Do you see my, okay, screen sharing has stopped. And we can do this. Here we go. And Microsoft PowerPoint. Share. Here we go. Okay. I think we just have a few minutes left. I want to make sure that we make sure that we maybe share. Some of you are new to regulatory science. And so I want to make sure that we do have some opportunity to talk about the research that takes place in regulatory science. So I'm going to pivot this now to the regulatory science part and hand it over to Dr. Church.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So just to give you a little flavor as to what we do, if you could go to the next slide, please. Our students are involved in a lot of different things. We have student organizations that were started by our undergraduate students. Our RegSC, which is our research team, currently has 24 members. We've had many more over the past 3 years, but currently we're at 24. Our PDD, or Pre-Pharmacy Society, has just about 47 members currently. We do offer different types of research and help individuals with internships. So we have our own research team that produces a lot of really phenomenal research. In fact, we've had 27 poster presentations at professional meetings alone to date. Next slide, please. To give you a feel of some of the data, we just want to go through a couple of them. So the first one, you had heard us talk a little bit about active pharmaceutical ingredients and finished pharmaceuticals at the beginning of our talk. And this was a study done by one of our students, a couple of our students, to look at how these types of elements were being treated through the global supply chain, meaning how are they being managed and monitored. And one way of doing that is by taking a look at the FDA's warning letters. The FDA will send out warning letters to companies that they find have specific infractions. And it could be everything as minimal as you didn't file the appropriate paperwork, all the way to something as massive as you said you put compound A into your drugs, and what we see is you're putting compound B into your drugs. Please change that immediately. These letters range in variety and scope across the board, but what this research found by looking at China, India, and the US is that there were major findings for countries that we get a lot of our products from, including China and India. And conversely, for the finished pharmaceutical products, we see a little bit of a switch with China getting 19 and India getting 24, but the US getting 41 violations in terms of the finished medical product. So although our initial products, these active pharmaceutical ingredients, seem to be getting a lot of warning letters issued towards them overseas in the beginning, and the US is only getting 3, what this tells us is that a lot of our ingredients are being manufactured someplace else and being brought to the US to be combined into a finished product, hence the 41 companies that got warning letters. From this research, what we can say is that it's imperative for us to identify where we can impose quality controls or have better quality assurance on a lot of the products that we are looking at. This means that we need training and additional oversight to really make sure that these gaps are met or closed, so that going forward, our pharmaceutical products can be assured of good quality. Next slide, please. So this is a study that is recent. One of our students is looking at race and ethnicity and mental health. And this is a huge area. I mean, in most societies, when you talk about mental health, it's something that exists only at home. And the minute you open that door and walk out onto the street into the general public, it no longer exists. And, you know, I thought that was just the Irish way of talking about mental illness. But here I'm learning that, in fact, it's the majority of cases across the board. But in Asian societies and in Asian cultures, it's even more frowned upon, where in some respects, it's not even discussed at home. What this study was looking at were adolescent and young adults and seeing how they were being included or not included into clinical trials for mental health disorders, such as PTSD, ADHD, anxiety, those classical things that we think of when we think of mental health. And what was found in this study is that there was an unequal reporting of race and ethnicity. As you can see from this diagram on this slide, what you see are Latino, white, and Black youth, not even a mention of Asian youth whatsoever. And this is consistent with known barriers that we see in minority enrollment across the board, not only in mental health, but in studies in general. Some of the future directions from this research indicate that we should identify the challenges and barriers that exist in this mental health research space to help promote good health among minorities. And through that increased inclusivity, what you'll get are improved health outcomes for everyone, not just the three racial and ethnic groups that you see pictured here. Next slide, please. The other unique area that we see a lot of research in is in antidepressants. And this is a study that one of our students is currently working on that really found that there were lower rates of minority enrollment in Asian American, African American, and Hispanic Americans in these studies. Not only did these studies omit people who were pregnant or had risk of suicide, but they weren't doing a very good job of going out and recruiting minority populations. The recommendation from this study was that better clinical trial representation of the depressed community overall will help us understand safety and efficacy information for antidepressants and the drugs that get co-prescribed with those antidepressants. Because if you're studying a drug, you shouldn't limit it to suburban white males over 45 who predominantly enroll into these clinical trials because they have A, the time, and B, the know-how of where to go to enroll. But we should be making sure that our drugs are applicable and approachable for everyone, especially the people that are going to be taking them. So by excluding people, we're making sure that it's only proven to be safe and effective in one type of population. Next slide, please. So we've thrown out a lot of information today. We've talked about a lot of different things. We've gone and talked about things from all the way from vaccine trials all the way through to our current research here at USC. And obviously there are going to be lots of questions. And if you have them, please reach out. You can find us at our website or our general email address. We're pretty approachable, I think, for the most part. Next slide, please. We do have both undergraduate and graduate programs. This is just a flavor of both of those degrees. We are working on a new bachelor's degree that hopefully will be out in the next 2 years, fingers crossed. And we have a slew of graduate programs as well as certificate programs that we are happy to have students in. Next slide, please. This is our wonderful faculty. You can reach out to any of us. Next slide, please. And none of this work can be done without our amazing staff, who really are the backbone and the heart of what we do. Next slide, please. And also, I hope you don't mind that we sniped your logo from your website, just to say a special thank you to our host for today's talk. Next slide, please.
So there's thank you in all the different languages. We do have some questions. I think in this short time, I could answer quickly. One is the world map of clinical trials. Some of South and North Korea are included in China. Well, the map is really just kind of, it's a clinicaltrials.gov. It's just really difficult to show a generalized map showing all the different areas. But if you're interested, clinicaltrials.gov. It's a very informative website. You go and you can actually drill down to all the specific studies. So it's all, it's a way for the clinical trial process to be very transparent. So please, if you're interested, go and explore. The other question is, can we trust data from China, knowing that they have well-publicized issue with data forging and human rights violation? You know what? In time, we will see. I think it's it's very difficult right now in this global world to keep things very hidden, unless you're like North Korea and you don't have diplomatic relationship with anybody. There are no planes going in and out. You have no communication, no cell phone communication with people in North Korea. That's probably excuse my spam calls that are coming in. That's probably like the only country that is so isolated. I mean, if something was happening, if people were dying in China, you would hear about it. I mean, I think just because I have so many Chinese friends, Chinese colleagues, Chinese students, they know somebody, they know somebody, they know somebody. And so, you know, in terms of being COVID, being, if you say it's a conspiracy, well, my sister-in-law was sick and was, you know, rushed to the hospital with COVID. I have, you know, friends of friends who have died of COVID. And so, you know, you can't, in this world where communication is quite accessible, it's hard now. You know, this is not 30 years ago where you could potentially hide things for a very long time. And I think if people are starting to die from COVID vaccines or in mass, I think we would hear about it. I mean, but then I'm always a kind of a glasses half full kind of a person. The other one is, I was really interested in the research done on antidepressant depression clinical studies with Asian population. Is there any way I could get involved with it? Absolutely. Contact Dr. Church. He you know, or myself or anybody. Yes, this is an area, you know, the antidepressant and depression, you know, just like arthritis used to be, it's a very cultural thing where people will be like, snap out of it. What do you mean? You know,
you're just sad.
There wasn't even a word for depression. Like, you know, when you're old, of course you're gonna have aches and pains, you know. When you're old, of course, you're going to have a hard time walking. You know, what do you mean hip replacement? Or what do you mean, you know, arthritis? You know, that's your hands. Of course, your hands are going to be like this when you're old. That's what means being old. And so the idea of things like arthritis being a medical condition or depression being a medical condition is something, you know, quite foreign to certain cultures.
Definitely. And we would be happy to talk to you more about these projects that we have. And we have many, many more. So feel free to check us out.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions before we sign off?
There's a final one. Thank you.
Looks like one more just came in. Oh, no, it was thank you so much.
It was thank you so much. And I would like to thank both of you, Doctors Church and Pacifici, for this incredibly informative discussion. I learned so much, actually. I did not know what was going on in the world. And now I know a little bit more about regulatory science, and especially in the context of East Asia. And I really look forward to the additional discussions that will take place in the spring with this partnership. So
Definitely.
Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you for everything today.
Thank you for having us. This has been such a pleasure. Bye, everyone.
See you. Thank you so much.